You are listening to the Business Talk podcast, a show that brings you conversations with global research scholars and academicians from around the world. I am Deepak, your host from India. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Charles Cho as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Before we begin, let me introduce the guest for today's episode. Dr. Charles Cho serves as a professor of sustainability accounting and holds the Irving K. Hope Chair in Business and Sustainability at the Schulich School of Business, York University. An accomplished scholar in the field of sustainability accounting, Dr. Charles earned his PhD in Business Administration in Accounting from the University of Central Florida. With more than 2 decades of experience spanning teaching, research, and professional engagement across multiple countries, his work centers on social and environmental accounting and accountability, corporate social responsibility, and accounting for the public interest. His research appears in leading academic journals, including Accounting, Auditing and Accountability Journal, Accounting, Organizations and Society, Business and Society, Critical Perspectives on Accounting, European Accounting Review, and the Journal of Business Ethics, among others. Professor Charles served as an editor of Accounting Forum, Accounting and Business Ethics, section co-editor of the Journal of Business Ethics, and associate editor of Business and Society. Beyond academia, he contributes his expertise to several professional bodies, such as CPA Ontario's Sustainability Strategic Advisory Committee, the Club Canadien de Toronto's Board of Directors, and the European Accounting Association's Stakeholder Reporting and DEI committees, and is a member of the Global Sustainability Standards Board of the Global Reporting Initiative. A globally recognized thought leader, Professor Charles is a frequent keynote speaker at international conferences and is often sought after media outlets for his insights on sustainability and governance. His work has earned him numerous honors, including selection among the top 50 academic and research support projects by the Republic of Korea's Prime Minister and Minister of Education, the Honorable Knight Award from the University of Central Florida's Hall of Fame, and recognition among the top 2% of cited accounting researchers worldwide. Earlier in his career, he gained professional experience with KPMG and other public accounting firms in auditing and taxation. In this episode, Dr. Charles joins us to delve into his thought-provoking research, organized hypocrisy, organizational facade, and sustainability reporting. Now, without keeping you waiting any longer, let us formally welcome Dr. Charles Shaw to the conversation. Professor Charles, it's a privilege to have you with us today, and we are truly grateful for the time you have taken to be here.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the very nice introduction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor, sustainability has become a common corporate buzzword. Yet, the paper highlights a persistent gap between what companies say and what they actually do. What do you think drives this enduring disconnect between sustainability discourse and practice?
Well, yeah, that's the essence of the paper, and most of my research has focused on this question about this disconnect between what companies are doing and their reporting. In today's language, we use the word greenwashing because it's basically saying something false, or otherwise lying. So they're just not doing what they say, or they're not doing what they're not following up on what they say they will do. So what drives that is that there is a very large degree of freedom to what companies are allowed to communicate. Yes, we're going to talk about maybe some regulations later, that there are some reporting standards, reporting guidelines, mandatory sometimes, or very precise ways to report information. However, the biggest issue is that freedom has not been regulated, but importantly has not been enforced. So even when there is some regulation on what companies must say, must report, there have been some loopholes or non-compliance or not following the regulation, and then no consequence. So if there's no consequence on a regulation, what happens is that people do whatever they want. It's like having, a speed limit on this highway and nobody checks, or even if you do check and if you do get caught, there is no consequence. So you get tickets or the consequences are very, very low. So that drives the fact that the gap between what companies are saying and doing can only get larger because it becomes very selective. Companies can be very creative and sometimes selective to what they want to say. For example, let's not talk too much about this bad news, or let's emphasize the good news. But the regulation said, well, you have to report more on bad news, but then you don't. Okay, then there is no consequence. Then what can you do? Like you give them such freedom, you put a law or regulation in place that you don't enforce. So that's kind of the root reasons. Is also that there is a lot of communication channels today, sustainable report, uh, website, social media. So it's easy really to put things out there quite lightly, and then without substance, and then the action is not there. So then there's a gap that is created by that difference between talk and action.
Professor, the paper critiques how legitimacy theory and signaling theory often produce contradictory conclusions. How do the concepts of organized hypocrisy and organizational facade provide a more nuanced understanding of corporate sustainability reporting?
Well, in research in this area, the two theories you mentioned, legitimacy and signaling, have been the most widely used and applied and tested. And the reason is that, okay, they are relatively straightforward in a way that they look at the same sustainable report and then they tell a very opposite story, very different story. So signaling story, as we see in the paper, says basically that company voluntarily disclose information, sustainable information, because they have something positive to communicate. The report is considered to be credible and allows for, okay, this is a great performance, positive superior performance. The opposite theory, legitimacy, is that companies disclose this information, but to protect their legitimacy, to protect what they have to be careful about. Okay, so they have a reputation, for example. So they need to, maybe have a way to communicate something that negative happened to kind of compensate with a communication disclosure. So they do have a good ways to explain why and how companies disclose such information, or sometimes they do not, but it's a bit simplistic. So what this paper brings is that, first of all, organizations are not uniform. They're not in one voice, especially large ones, right? They have different divisions, different departments. They have to respond to different stakeholders inside and outside. And so what this organized hypocrisy and facades are bringing is nuance. Nuance that this is not all black or white. It's not everything or nothing. It's not binary one or zero. So it's not just legitimacy all the way, but it's not all signaling all the way. Okay, there is also something in the middle, something that can be explained in a more nuanced, subtle way, because the reality of organization is that it's much more complex. It's not just one organization that says something and that's it. No, there's a lot of stakeholders inside. There's a lot of implications, and that's where this hypocrisy theory becomes quite useful, because instead of asking whether this is all false or all true, is about how organizations manage these conflicting expectations from different stakeholders through different forms of communications. So it moves kind of the discussion from truth versus lie or deception to understanding how and why organizations work on the different conflicting situations and pressures that are natural. And we're going to talk about that, I know, in a bit later, but they are inherent conflicting stakeholder expectations and demands. And that's when hypocrisy comes to play, to try to explain that, why in some cases companies are disclosing one way, and then to some other audiences, they will disclose in other ways.
Professor, the term organized hypocrisy sounds provocative. Could you unpack what it means in the corporate context and how it helps explain inconsistencies between a company's sustainability talk, decisions, and actions?
Yeah, so just to get started on hypocrisy, it is this inconsistency between what companies are saying, talk, making decision and acting on action, right? So yes, I get that a lot, and I used to get wow, hypocrisy is a very strong word, it's a negative word. It sounds like accusation. But if you look at where we got it from, it's from Niels Bronson's, who is a social theorist, a very famous one. His work somehow has not been used a lot in accounting, at least, and so this is a way to bring that because we think it fits well. So it's not necessarily okay all negative, right? It's about really understanding the difference. But when you have different stakeholders and you have to kind of satisfy each of them, you are almost forced and almost constrained to use hypocrisy to try to appease those tensions, try to make them happy. So talk, decision, action to different type of stakeholders, such as investors, such as employees, such as NGOs, the government. And don't get me wrong, we are not here to totally say, oh, it's okay to be hypocrite. No, but we also want to understand that hypocrisy is a strategy that companies may be using and may have to use to kind of appease the tension between stakeholder different expectations. So it's really how organization can survive, can make it out in environments where the demands of the stakeholders are just impossible to reconcile. Okay, it's just like oil and water. You cannot mix different stakeholder expectations. You know, each stakeholder has their own goal and their own expectations. Organizations have to satisfy this stakeholder and that stakeholder. And one of the solutions that they found is using hypocrisy. And that again, that doesn't excuse that the contradictions and obviously the lying, but at least it's a way to understand the behaviors.
Professor, the paper introduces three types of facades: rational, progressive, and reputation. How do these facades function within organizations to manage stakeholder expectations?
Well, I see the facade as either a mask, like you're wearing a different mask to talk to each person or each stakeholder, or maybe you just use it at different stories. So they basically tell three different stories to three different audiences. So as the paper says, give example, rationale. What is the rationale? Rationale is pure economically based, primary at what? Investors. What investors do? They want value for their money. They want shareholder return. They want risk management. They want good business decision. That's the, as I said, economic story, right? Progressive is what is progressive is future innovation oriented. We're innovating, we're investing in cleaner, innovative technology. We are in developing new policy. We are going to this direction to look at the future. It's really about promising about the future and kind of creating some momentum and some hope for high progress technologically, for example. And then last but not least, there is a reputation, which is what? Well, reputation, you have to speak to the broader society, right? So we want to protect the value, we want to protect biodiversity, the nature, respecting social values, human rights, communities, being a responsible citizen. And so you have to build that reputation to say, well, this is a socially responsible company. If you take each of the story I just told you for each of the three, okay, rational, progressive, reputation, they make perfect sense. If you just one audience at a time, no problem. The problem is when you put them together. And the reality is that they do exist together. All of the stakeholders of the story, the audiences, do coexist, do exist together in society and within the organization. So it's about when you have these simultaneous kind of conflicts of interest, okay, then the facade, becomes like, okay, this is a different story. And you have to understand again, organizations don't have only one face or one facade or one public face. They have multiple ones. Sometimes they don't even know what they're saying each other. They're so large that sometimes it looks like multiple different companies within one company, which is very true for multinational, like all the subsidiaries, all the small departments, large departments. And so this is kind of where the facade analogy and application come from.
Professor, the paper mentioned that managers often face precarious moral positions when balancing conflicting stakeholder demands. In your view, how can leadership navigate this tension without slipping into mere symbolic compliance?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that these tensions are real and they're difficult. If you are putting yourself in the shoes of a manager, they face everyday dilemmas and conflicting expectations. You want, on one hand, investors want, financial growth. Employees mean they want a more purpose-driven organization. Community, they want protection. They want support. Governments, they want security, etc. So it's hard. When I say we say more precarious, more position is that sometimes they are in a vulnerable, weakened position. It's an ethical dilemma because sometimes they don't know what to do. There is no right answer, so that's a gray area. The problem comes when, the organizations is pretending and ignoring these issues, right? So the good, healthy organization is to be honest and transparent. Just admit that we are facing these issues instead of pretending that you can kind of solve it or you can address it, you can take a shortcut. Those kind of more dangerous. But this more position is because that's where we have to be humble and honest and say, hey, we are in this situation. We are in a high conflict. There's some tension, and we need to work together to get it worked out and addressed. The other part is governance. Is also that sustainability, it's not just communication, right? Some people just think that as long as you have a report out there, we are doing sustainability action. It's not true. It has to be embedded in like investment decisions, in compensation of executive, of investment capital allocation, etc. So you have to be serious about what you do, not just having these check the box kind of things that we have to report. And so it's not just about not having contradiction. We do always have contradictions, some companies and even us as people, we do have contradictions. It's about admitting it and try to maybe work towards reducing those contradictions. And then maybe we can achieve a more sustainable goal or some objective. But again, it can only come when you are honest and transparent in your process.
Dr. Charles, your analysis of two major US oil corporations during the Arctic National Wildlife Refugee debates provides rich insights. What specific discrepancies between corporate talk and action did you observe in their sustainability communications?
Well, this was kind of the favorite part of the paper, right? So this is the kind of illustrations of, okay, let's look at some examples here. Oil, obviously, were being the one of the most polluting industry, and in the US, they're very, very large organizations. So what we're trying to do here is, okay, let's look at whether how this communicate about sustainability. Okay, and we kind of knew that, of course, it's going to be very glossy, positive reports, and then also how they behave on the backstage or politically speaking by maybe engaging with politicians to have regulations that are, pro drilling oil so that they can make more money. So companies basically, if you look at if we look at the analysis, is they talk a lot about the protection of environment, biodiversity, human rights, protecting indigenous community, stewardship, etc. They use a lot of these buzzwords, and honestly, a lot of these communications can be copy paste, right? They can, it's so positive about everything, so it's like a template almost. So they also talk about investment in clean energy, responsible action, responsible operations, and being responsible citizens. And then the different part of when we look at some other data, outside data, also financial reports, it was about making some political contributions. They're legal. I mean, they're legal in the US. Political action committees are legal entity that are sponsored by the organizations, and they distribute the money to politicians, like regulators and policymakers. So we saw clearly that the same companies that talk so much about we care about the environment gave some political support to the legislators that specifically vote for drilling and very polluting type of legislation, right? So this is where we saw the biggest discrepancy, the exact same company doing the exact opposite of what they say, right? And so what was fascinating is internally within the report, almost everything was internally consistent. Okay. The contradiction came, of course, when you go outside the company, across organizations, and then this is where hypocrisy is. You talk inside that is consistent is very inconsistent and disconnected, from the actions you're doing. So in this case, it wasn't even polluting yet. It was about pushing for law, so lobbying for law that will allow me to make more money and pollute the planet. But in your report, you just said that you care about the environment and you're going to develop, you know, cleaner energy technology. So here is a perfect example of here is the oil company. And really, I like this part. I mean, not because I find it's good, I just find it fascinating that the exact same. I had to check a few times. Like, are you serious? Like, wow. So this was the most fascinating part of the paper, of the illustration. Yes, of course.
Professor, some researchers argue that aspirational sustainability talk, even if not yet matched by action, can be beneficial because it keeps companies oriented toward progress. Do you agree? Or does this risk normalizing corporate greenwashing?
Yeah, but that's a very interesting debate that's happening in our field and in other even our strategy communication colleagues. It can be actually useful to have aspirational talk if it's to create maybe some kind of goal and expectation. So, for example, like these days we have seen companies like making commitments for net zero, and of course, protection, diversity, human rights, etc. Everything we talked about. So these commitments, once it's out there, could be a kind of a voluntary or involuntary set of goals. Let's redo that because we said it. It's an aspiration, it's a goal. Okay. But the problem is that if that aspirational talk becomes kind of the substitute for the action, instead of doing it, let's just leave it there as a talk and nothing else happens. But if you use it as a motivation, as a motivator to say, hey, we have this big dream and aspiration. And you know what? Even if it doesn't reach exactly at the level that you said, that the effort you make, in that case, I do think it's very useful. I think it can be quite impactful. But unfortunately, the behavior is more, let's put it out there and then we don't have to do much because people believe that we believe what we say we do. And that's when the problem is, and that's when we get into this greenwashing and then hypocrisy, etc. So it should be more like a path, a roadmap, rather than just a PR, public relations strategy, marketing strategy, right? So yeah, if it's used properly, I think aspirational talk can be good. But it has to be matched by action, right? So
Yes, the paper argues that broader economic and institutional pressures constrain corporate action choices. How much can we realistically expect from voluntary sustainability disclosures within the current capitalist framework?
well, I think we talked about a little bit at the first question about regulation, right? So if you leave it voluntary, there is a room for greenwashing that opens up widely. Okay, so without regulation, so voluntary, you disclose not only this year, but not this year, whatever you want, how you want, where you want, that becomes a mess. You're gonna have so much disparity across reporting and disclosure, and so that doesn't help anybody actually. But there are proponents to say, hey, we should leave it voluntary, those who want. But I don't understand why that would help anything. So yes, there are pressures, there are constraints, but just like we have regulation, mandatory reporting requirements for financial information, I don't see why we cannot do the same for sustainability. And I understand the constraints. Reporting on this topic is time consuming, is expensive, is burdensome. We see a lot of what's happening today with European standards, with the ISSB and the GRI, which I understand like all of these, voluntary versus mandatory, the scope, all of that, it's fine. But if we leave it at the voluntary stage, which to be honest, most disclosure standard right now, reporting standards are voluntary. EDISSB is still, to some extent, and today mostly voluntary. GRI is voluntary. The only mandatory is the European standards that also has a lot of political changes around it because they are, again, there's a lot of interest, conflict of interest. But anyway, what I mean is leaving it voluntary and not enforcing it will worsen. I'm a strong believer in regulation that is enforced because we can look at the carrot and the stick. The carrot for this one does not work. So we have to use a stick. So for me, voluntary, no, it's not. And you know what? If it's burdensome and constraining, well, so be it. I mean, we live in a world where we need to make companies more accountable. And so if you don't make them report true and accurate and complete data information on their impact, then the world is not going to improve. Nothing will improve. So I'm not a very big fan of leaving it voluntary.
Professor, if sustainability reports often serve as facades, how can investors, regulators, and the public better evaluate the authenticity of these disclosures?
So that's a great question because now we wonder, like, how do we detect greenwashing? How do we catch this, and how do we know? Well, my students, and now they're both at the graduate and undergraduate level, have had or are having a project that I call him a social audit, but it's more like we call it silent shadow. So you have a company report and you analyze the report just only, but in relation to everything that says about this company, other sources, government report, media reports, NGO reports, interviewing stakeholders. Like you have to have a much more investigative mindset. You have to be kind of play detective. So my undergrad students, I love it because I say you play the detective. I want to know if this report is true. You're going to audit it. And so I think, okay, not everyone does not have the time and desire or skills to do that. But today you have to be a lot more skeptical about a report because you know greenwashing is there and is there to stay. So what I'm suggesting to the broader public is critical skepticism, professional skepticism. Hey, they put a report out there, they put this commercial, they put this website or TV ad. Is it what's behind that? Okay. Because we have to be now careful of what companies are saying. Social media is another kind of a problem, but you can also react on social media and question a company. There's a whole technological improvement and development that has been the last 10, 15 years with the boom of social media. So it's also interesting that stakeholders today are more equipped and more aware of greenwashing practices. So I think it's becoming a little bit more difficult for companies to greenwash, which is a good thing. But I would say that everybody, when you go to even shopping, do your homework and read about things and investigate. And no, I'm not saying assuming that everything is false and bad, but a lot of things is questionable. A lot of data, a lot of information, net zero commitments, reduction of CO2. You go to this airline, you see on napkins, I don't think it's Delta Airlines or something, I don't want to point them out, but okay, there was a big thing that said we are green, I mean, come on, let's be skeptical. Let's be careful of all the claims that companies are making all over the place.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Based on your findings, what changes, whether in regulation, corporate governance, or stakeholder engagement, could help transform sustainability reporting from a performative exercise into a driver of substantive change?
Yeah, so this is the always the transformation, like the big solution question, right? So, so for me, there's a few things. Stronger regulation. I talked quite a bit about that during this podcast. So it's voluntary, changing to mandatory, and enforcement. That's going to reduce at least opportunities for greenwashing to some extent. Then we need better corporate structure like governance, compensation, incentive. So we need, better board board competence, oversight, investment decision making, strategy, and then stakeholder engagement, but like genuinely, genuinely engaging with the local and non-local stakeholders Okay, sometimes we forget about them, right? How come a company that is operating in a community doesn't engage with the citizens very locally, but they care about the global virtual kind of audiences? And how come they don't go as far as global stakeholders that they are making impact on, developing country, for example? You have to engage with stakeholders and really be serious about them to listen to the demands. And then the disclosure is one thing. We talked all about reporting and disclosure, but then we also have to talk about action. I was speaking to another podcast earlier that we argue today of whose standard is better, which standard setter is better, blah blah blah, and we forget about. And I think I mentioned we are a tree in the forest. We have to look at the forest and say, hey, reporting is one thing, but it's not just enough. That's one step. Okay. At the end of the day, we ask for better reporting for what? For better accountability and better action. Do something meaningful and truthful. So the question is really not, do they produce a reliable assessment report? That's one thing. But beyond that is, did they really reduce pollution? Did they really improve working conditions? Did they have better diversity protection outcomes? Some things like that are more action driven than reporting. So, when I see award scheme to award and say, congratulations on your report, to me, it drives me a little bit crazy. Like, why would you reward them on their report and not on their action, right? So this is really what we're trying to say is like, we know that in this paper, for example, in general, talk and actions and decisions may not be consistent, may not be alignable, but at least reduce that gap by getting close to the talk, right? And go to the action that are more sustainable.
Thank you, Professor Charles, for sharing your valuable research insights and helping us unpack the deeper layers of sustainability, reporting, and organizational behavior. Your reflections have provided our listeners with a richer perspective on how theory connects to real-world corporate practice. We appreciate your time and thoughtful discussion today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to share those insights.